Hello my friends, I want to welcome you to our channel, which will help you fall asleep easily and with benefit. Please like and subscribe to the channel so we can see that our efforts are not in vain. Share with us where you're watching from right now and what time it is for you. And while you're writing, I'll begin. 1962, on Corsica, in the Mediterranean Sea, in the town of Ajaccio. A boy was born into a family with noble roots but modest means. He was named Napoleon Bonaparte. The island had recently come under French rule, a transition that was very painful. The Corsicans did not consider themselves French. They were a proud, freedom-loving, and hot-tempered people raised in a tradition of resistance. Not long before, their land had fought for its independence under the leadership of Pascal Paoli. But now the cannons had fallen silent, and French administrators were imposing their own order, eradicating local customs. Napoleon's father, Carlo Bonaparte, came from an impoverished but ancient noble family, an educated man skilled at turning situations to his advantage. He adapted quickly to the new realities. He traveled to Paris, cultivated useful connections, and even obtained a position on the royal council. However, many of his countrymen considered this a betrayal. For the locals, Carlo had transformed from a patriot into an accomplice of the occupiers. He himself thought differently. He wanted to secure a worthy future for his children. It was thanks to his ambitions that the Bonaparte family was able to send their eldest son, Napoleon, to study in France. By temperament and language, Napoleon was not French. At home, he spoke the local Italo-Corsican dialect. He had a poor command of French, speaking with a strong accent. At the military college in Brienne, which he entered at the age of 9, he was an outsider. The son of a provincial nobleman with worn-out shoes, a withdrawn character, and a difficult temperament. He was poor, ambitious, and unskilled in small talk. They mocked him, taunted him as the Corsican upstart, imitating his speech and manners. But he responded only with silence, not out of cowardice, but because he was biding his time, gathering his strength. Resentment grew within him, and with it, an incredible determination. While his peers amused themselves, he devoured books. While others went home on vacation, he spent his time in the library. In letters home, he complained of loneliness and the hostility of his surroundings. But it was during those years that the idea took root in him. No one will give him anything for free. He must achieve everything himself. He was particularly interested in Caesar, Alexander the Great, and Plutarch. He mentally relived their exploits, analyzed their strategies. Even then, he had a feeling that he was not just a military man, but a personality born for great achievements. When his father died, Napoleon was only 15. The family was left with virtually no means. The care of his younger brothers and sisters fell on the shoulders of his mother, Letizia, a woman of firm and unyielding character. One of those who does not complain about fate but confronts it. She instilled in her children that the world is cruel and one must be prepared for it. It was from her that Napoleon inherited not only character traits, but also immense self-control and a sense of responsibility for his family. Even after becoming emperor, he would take care of his brothers, placing them on thrones, albeit temporarily. After finishing Brienne, he continued his education at the Paris Military School. This was the pinnacle of dreams for someone of his background, a poor nobleman from the periphery. There, they didn't just mock him, they despised him. The French nobility looked upon him as something alien and dangerous. However, even in this environment, Napoleon found his advantage knowledge. He excelled brilliantly in the exact sciences, especially mathematics and artillery. He was not just capable, he was the best in his course. It was this that secured his first appointment, second lieutenant of artillery in a regiment stationed in the south of France. He served in Auxonne and Valence, wrote works on the independence of Corsica, dreamed of returning home, and fantasized about liberating his native island from the French. His early works were full of pathos and animosity towards France. He admired Paoli, considering him a hero and a martyr. However, when he finally managed to return to the island to join the freedom fighters, things went differently. Pauli, who had been his idol, saw in the young man an overly ambitious and uncontrollable nature. Political differences escalated into personal enmity, and ultimately, Napoleon had to leave Corsica forever. He returned to France no longer a Corsican yearning for his homeland's independence, but a man rejected by both his own people and strangers. The idea solidified in his mind that he no longer belonged to any nation, and this became his advantage. He would belong only to himself. He would become French not by birth, but by right of his conquests, not because he was born in France, but because he would earn it. By that time, France stood on the threshold of momentous change. The monarch was still on the throne, but the ground was slipping from under his feet. A revolutionary spirit hung in the air, and for men like Napoleon, this meant only one thing: an opportunity had arisen. When the old order crumbles, a new man can rise to the top, not thanks to titles or connections, but thanks to his abilities. In the second half of the 1780s, France was seething. Although outwardly it still maintained the semblance of monarchical calm, the economy was in a severe crisis. The treasury was empty due to prolonged wars, including aid to the American colonies. At the same time, taxes fell almost entirely on the common people, peasants, workers, and city dwellers. The clergy and aristocracy, being privileged classes, lived carefree, paid no taxes, and retained levers of power, which caused increasing discontent and a sense of injustice. The monarchy under Louis XVI seemed helpless in the face of the approaching crisis. Attempts at reform failed. The royal court became increasingly detached from reality, while in the country, hunger, inflation, and protest sentiment grew. The ideas of Enlightenment philosophers, which had previously been discussed only in narrow circles, began to penetrate the masses. People increasingly thought about equality, justice, and their right to participate in governing the state. Ultimately, these processes culminated in a full-scale revolution. The fall of the Bastille marked the dawn of a new era. The old regime was crumbling. The king was losing power, the nobility their lands, the church's influence. In place of familiar France, an unknown and turbulent republic was emerging, where everything became possible, both dizzying ascent and rapid downfall. For young men like Napoleon Bonaparte, this was a unique historical chance. He was only 20 when the revolution began. He served in the artillery, possessing neither wealth nor connections nor a famous name. But now this no longer mattered. The revolution did not just open doors, it swept away all barriers. The army was in dire need of talented commanders. Noble officers were emigrating en masse, vacating positions. This was the first step for advancement. Bonaparte was first seriously noticed in 1793. During the siege of Toulon, a key port captured by royalists and handed over to the British. The siege was dragging on. The command was acting indecisively. Then a young artillery captain proposed a bold and precise plan to capture Fort Legalet, which dominated the harbor. It was this fort that offered control over the entire bay and, in essence, decided the outcome of the whole operation. Despite his youth and low rank, Bonaparte insisted on his plan and executed it brilliantly. French troops seized the necessary positions. The British left Toulon, and Bonaparte himself was promoted to brigadier general. He was only 24 years old. His name became known in Paris. Some admired his courage and engineering talent. Others began to understand that this man posed a danger to decisive, to independent. Rising too quickly, his career advancement was also helped by the fact that Bonaparte gained an influential patron, Augustin Robespierre, brother of the Jacobin leader. Thanks to this support, he strengthened his position, but simultaneously found himself in a vulnerable situation. Robespierre's fall in the summer of 1794 implicated all those associated with him. Bonaparte was arrested and held in custody for some time. His future hung by a thread. Fortunately for him, the political situation quickly changed. A few months later, he was released and assigned to serve in the Army's Topographic Bureau. This assignment was purely formal, almost a punishment. Work at a drawing board, far from the active army and glory. Bonaparte considered it humiliating, an annoying delay, but he did not break. He waited patiently. The opportunity presented itself in the autumn of 1795. Paris was on the brink of insurrection. Royalists were preparing to seize the capital to restore the monarchy. The Republican government had virtually no forces to resist. Then Paul Barras, one of the leaders of the Directory, remembered the man who had once saved Toulon. Bonaparte was entrusted with the defense of Paris. He acted quickly and ruthlessly. Key streets and squares were blocked by artillery. All approaches to the city's center were under control. When, on 13 Vendemiaire, October 5, 1795, columns of insurgents advanced to attack, Bonaparte did not hesitate to order fire. Grapeshot literally mowed down the attackers, scattering their ranks. Smoke engulfed the capital. Cries of horror echoed through the streets. The battle ended as quickly as it had begun. The victory was complete and extremely brutal. Bonaparte did not enter into negotiations, did not stall for time. He acted as a soldier, not a politician. And it was this that brought him recognition. Barras made him his protege, and Bonaparte received a new, much more significant appointment: commander of the Army of the Interior. Now he was not just a capable officer, but a man with real political weight. Everyone who watched his ascent understood this was only the beginning. But the main rise, the first campaign that would make him the idol of France and the nightmare of Europe, awaited him ahead in Italy. After the execution of Louis XVI in 1793, the French Revolution ceased to be a purely internal affair. The monarchical regimes of Europe, Austria, Prussia, Spain, England, and others perceived the young republic as a direct threat to the very foundations of their power. The ideas of liberty, popular sovereignty, and the rejection of monarchy, rapidly spreading from Paris, caused alarm in royal courts. Thus, one after another, coalitions began to form, uniting the efforts of the old regimes. France found itself encircled by enemies. The Austrians advanced in the east. The British ruled the seas unchallenged. The Spanish threatened in the south, and within the country, rebellions flared, the bloodiest of which was the Vendée. By 1796, the Republic had held on but was extremely exhausted. The economy lay in ruins, the army was drained of blood, and confidence in the Directory was undermined. To retain power and breathe new energy into the country, the government decided to strike a blow capable of turning the tide of the war and regaining political initiative. This blow was the Italian campaign. The military-political logic of this decision was obvious. Austria, France's main enemy on the continent, controlled northern Italy. If the Austrians could be driven out of these regions and their ally, the Kingdom of Sardinia, knocked out of the war, France would not only weaken one of the leaders of the coalition, but also gain the opportunity to create a network of dependent republics that would serve as a buffer and a source of resources. However, at that time, the army on the Italian front was in a deplorable state. The soldiers were dressed in rags, starving, suffering from disease, and completely lacking discipline. It was there, in March 1796, that the 26-year-old General Napoleon Bonaparte was sent. He was not a celebrated commander. He had no noble birth. But behind him were already Toulon, the suppression of the Parisian uprising, and a reputation as a man who acted quickly and decisively. From the very first days of his command, Bonaparte showed that he did not intend to follow established rules. He immediately made personnel changes, restored order at headquarters, organized minimal supplies, and, most importantly, addressed the soldiers with a speech where he spoke not of duty or homeland, but of glory, victories, trophies, and the rich lands of Italy that awaited them ahead. These words had an effect. The exhausted soldiers suddenly saw in their new commander not just a chief, but a man ready to lead them to success and a better life. The offensive began in April. Bonaparte's strategy differed sharply from the generally accepted one of the time. He did not prolong preparations, did not wait for reinforcements, but struck first and swiftly. The opponents, the Austrians and Sardinians, did not have time to react. He methodically destroyed them piece by piece, severing their communications and forcing battle on advantageous terrain for himself. After only a few weeks, the King of Piedmont sued for peace, withdrawing Sardinia from the war. This was the first major success. Then followed a series of battles, each adding to his glory. The Battle of Lodi strengthened the army's faith in its commander. The enemy held positions behind the Adda River, and the path to them lay across a narrow bridge swept by Austrian artillery. Despite the danger, Bonaparte ordered an attack. He personally led the grenadiers forward, and his courage inspired the soldiers. The bridge was captured, the enemy driven back. Later, Napoleon would admit that it was after Lodi that he felt capable of influencing not only the outcome of a battle, but also the course of history itself. The Battle of Arcole was a test of endurance and fortitude. The terrain was swampy, communication between battalions was lost. Cannons had to be dragged through the mud by hand. Nevertheless, Bonaparte managed to rally the army and lead it into the attack, again participating personally in the fight. At a critical moment, he seized the flag and rushed onto the bridge under a hail of bullets. He nearly died, falling into the river, but the soldiers surged after him. The enemy retreated. Victory was achieved not by numbers, but by force of character. The culmination of the campaign was the Battle of Rivoli. The Austrians tried to relieve the besieged fortress of Mantua, throwing large forces into the battle. The French, though outnumbered, skillfully used the terrain, seized the dominant heights, and struck from the flanks. The battle lasted 2 days. The result, a complete rout of the Austrian army, thousands of prisoners, captured cannon and banners. Mantua soon capitulated. Italy was under French control. However, the victories on the battlefields were only part of the plan. Bonaparte began to build a new political structure in the region. So-called sister republics were created in the conquered lands: the Cisalpine Republic, the Ligurian Republic, the Roman Republic, formerly independent states inspired by the ideals of liberty and equality. In reality, they were puppet entities supplying France with soldiers, money, and food. The army was fed and clothed at the expense of these lands. Concurrently, there was a massive removal of cultural treasures, paintings, sculptures, books, coins. Trophies from Italian museums and monasteries were sent to Paris to adorn the future Louvre. This was presented as the salvation of art, but many perceived it as outright plunder. After the fall of Mantua and a series of defeats, Austria was on the verge of collapse. Bonaparte advanced towards Vienna, but Paris, alarmed by his growing influence, ordered him to stop. Peace negotiations began. In October 1797, the Treaty of Campo Formio was signed. Austria recognized all French conquests in Italy and ceded territories on the Rhine. For the first time since the start of the Revolutionary Wars, the French Republic had achieved a complete and legally formalized victory. Bonaparte returned to France a triumphant hero. His name was known even to those who had never taken an interest in politics. He became the hero of the Republic, the personification of a new era, a man whose will and determination had proven stronger than the old empires. But in his head, a new idea was already brewing, the idea of an expedition unlike any other. And the place where he wished to leave his mark was not Europe, but Egypt. In the spring of 1798, the name of Napoleon Bonaparte resounded throughout France. The Directory simultaneously realized that it could not remove him without risk to itself. The people adored him, the army trusted him. An elegant solution was found. Bonaparte was offered command of an expedition not in France or Europe, but in distant Egypt. There, he would not only pose no threat to the government, but might also solve an important foreign policy problem. France could not directly invade England. Its fleet was weaker, and a direct confrontation threatened defeat. However, it was possible to strike at British interests in India. Egypt, although formerly a province of the Ottoman Empire, occupied a strategic position between Europe and India. Control over it meant control over the eastern route of the British Empire. Bonaparte agreed immediately. He saw in it an opportunity to go beyond the European theater and solidify his image, not only as a military commander, but also as a statesman, a builder of a new civilization. He dreamed of Eastern glory, of the exploits of Alexander the Great, whom he had admired since youth. He intended not just to fight, but to bring the light of knowledge to lands he considered plunged in darkness. In May 1798, a huge fleet set sail from Toulon. Over 300 ships transported 35,000 soldiers and officers, thousands of horses, cannon, and, very importantly, 167 scientists, mathematicians, astronomers, architects, geologists, linguists. This was not just an army. It was an expedition of the Enlightenment. Among its members were men who would later become the founders of Egyptology. Bonaparte founded an institute in Egypt, and the expedition carried printing presses, microscopes, instruments, and field laboratories. The first target was Malta, an island belonging to the Order of St. John. Bonaparte easily forced the knights to capitulate. He quickly implemented administrative reforms, abolished old orders, disarmed the clergy, seized supplies, and after a week sailed on towards Egypt. Malta was merely a prologue, an easy victory before the real test. The next day, a new form of government was proclaimed, the consulate. Formally, this meant the restoration of order. A government of 3 consuls was established, with Bonaparte listed as first among equals. However, it was clear from the start that there was no question of equality. The others, Seize and Ducasse, became secondary figures. All key decisions were made by Napoleon. He rejected revolutionary parliamentarism, dissolved the Council of 500, replacing it with a more obedient Senate, restored control over the army, and began a large-scale reform of the administrative system. France was being restructured not towards anarchy, but towards rigid centralization. The people, weary of disorder, accepted this without resistance. Moreover, many perceived Bonaparte's arrival as deliverance from chaos. Newspapers wrote of him as the man capable of ending the revolution. His image combined the memory of Republican struggle, military glory, and the promise of order. He did not abolish the achievements of the revolution. He preserved the civil code, freedom of conscience, and educational reform. But under his control, former freedoms disappeared. There was no longer talk of popular sovereignty. It was about stability, discipline, and the greatness of the state. Formally, he remained first consul, but in fact, he became the ruler of France. Laws were created in his offices. His signature made appointments. His will decided destinies. Thus ended the era of revolutionary chaos, and a new chapter began, the era of one-man rule. He had not yet taken the crown, but he already firmly held the country in his hands. The first years after the coup of 18 Brumaire were a time for France that seemed almost incredible. After 10 years of revolution, terror, civil war, and political experiments, for the first time in a long period, the country felt order. A man had come to power capable of acting quickly and harshly, imposing discipline not only in the army, but also in state institutions. Napoleon concentrated his efforts on restoring governability. He reformed the administration, established a strict vertical power structure, created the position of prefects in the departments, and restored funding for the judicial system. In 1800, the Bank of France was created, which helped stabilize the financial situation. Taxes were unified, uniform weights, and measures were introduced, and the first major codifications of law were carried out. Everything in his actions was subordinated to one logic: order, efficiency, centralized control. He did not abolish the achievements of the revolution. On the contrary, he consolidated them, but turned them into elements of a new rational system. Freedom of religion, secular education, the abolition of feudal privileges, and equality before the law were preserved, but now not as ideals, but as structural elements of statehood. There was no longer talk of popular sovereignty. It was about a strong government capable of holding the country back from disintegration. In 1802, when the people had grown accustomed to the new order, a plebiscite was held. The question was clear: should Napoleon Bonaparte be consul for life? The official results were almost unanimous. The outcome of the plebiscite surprised few and was not even decisive. The real essence lay elsewhere. France no longer resisted personal power. On the contrary, it desired it. Against this backdrop, the idea of restoring the monarchy, but in a new form, ceased to seem seditious. Bonaparte did not intend to become king of France. That would be a return to the past he had fought against. He wanted something different, a new title, a new image, a new system. France needed not a dynasty, but a founder. And in 1804, such a decision was made. Napoleon would become Emperor of the French. While preparations were underway, a personal story that had begun long before the coronation continued in the shadow of great events. The story of his wife, Josephine de Beauharnais, the woman who had been by his side from the very beginning. She was 6 years his senior, originally from Martinique, had survived the guillotining of her first husband, raised two children, and was highly respected in Parisian society. When they met in 1795, she was already considered a society lady, intelligent, refined, influential. Napoleon fell in love swiftly and recklessly. His letters, full of delight and longing, speak of a man who, despite his outward coldness, experienced truly deep feelings. They married in the spring of 1796, literally days before his departure for Italy. It was an impulsive marriage. He sought love, she sought protection. And although the relationship from the very beginning was full of jealousy, resentment, and quarrels, they remained together. Josephine accompanied him in public life, was by his side during moments of triumph and crisis, and had the ability to smooth over sharp edges and win over even his fiercest opponents. Becoming first consul, Napoleon not only did not distance himself from her, he strengthened her position. Despite the lack of children in their marriage, despite the rumors and reproaches, he kept her close. And when the moment of coronation arrived, he decided she should be part of it. He could have placed the crown on his own head alone, but he chose a symbol that not everyone understood, but everyone saw. On December 2nd, 1804, in Notre Dame Cathedral, a ceremony took place that surpassed in scale and spectacle anything Paris had seen. Since the Bourbons, under the vaults of the Gothic cathedral gathered politicians, diplomats, generals, and figures from science and art. At the center of the altar sat Pope Pius VII, personally invited to lend religious legitimacy to the event. But the key decision Napoleon kept for himself. When the moment of coronation arrived, he did not allow the Pope to place the crown on his head. He approached the altar, took the crown in his hands, and placed it on his own head. This gesture was premeditated. He did not want to seem indebted to either the church or tradition. He wanted to show that power emanated from himself. Then he turned to Josephine, who stood nearby, and with the same solemn calm, placed the Empress's crown on her head. This was not only personal recognition, it was a public affirmation of her place in the new state. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite the lack of an heir, he made her part of the ritual of power. The coronation ended with a solemn choir, fanfares, and prayer. Upon leaving the cathedral, Paris saw a new form of power. Not a king by right of birth, but an emperor by right of action. A man who had not inherited a throne, but built one. After this, France officially became an empire. Old institutions were renamed. The army became the Imperial Army. The Minister of the Interior became a grand officer of the empire. Senators became pillars of the new regime. Everything the revolution had created was now shaped according to a single model: subordination to the center, efficiency, structure. Bonaparte's empire was not a continuation of the old order, as under the Bourbons, nor was it the revolution. It was a third state, a system in which law became an instrument of will, an order, a form of legitimacy. Everything that had recently seemed wild or impossible, coronation, titles, regalia, now appeared natural. The people accepted this power because it brought results. Europe still hesitated, but France already followed the man it had elevated to the summit. France entered 1805 with a completely new status. Its ruler, recently crowned emperor, concentrated in his hands not only symbolic power, but also the real mechanisms of governance. Internally, there was stability, a centralized system, reforms, a loyal army, and a revived economy. Externally, an anxious silence, but behind this silence lurked a growing threat. Napoleon's coronation was perceived by the monarchies of Europe as a challenge. It was perceived particularly painfully in London, St. Petersburg, and Vienna, capitals of powers that had previously been unable to reconcile themselves to the successes of the French Revolution. Now they had to deal not with a chaotic and unpredictable republic, but with a powerful and stable empire. It seemed that the very idea of legitimacy had changed its guise from divine anointing to the will of the people and military genius. For traditional monarchs, this was not just troubling. It was dangerous. First and foremost, Great Britain opposed him, the only European power that had never made a lasting peace with revolutionary France. After the short-lived Peace of Amiens, broken barely a year later, it resumed the blockade of French ports, intensified its spy network, and began preparing a new coalition. Soon, Austria joined, eager to regain lost territories and take revenge for the humiliation in Italy. Russia, under the leadership of the young Emperor Alexander I, also expressed willingness to participate in the European alliance. And although the motives of each side were different, they were united by a common goal: to prevent Napoleon from establishing himself as the new master of the continent. The formation of the Third Anti-French Coalition proceeded rapidly. England took on the financial support. The Austrians prepared an army, concentrating it in Bavaria. Russia promised to field over 100,000 soldiers, who were to link up with their allies in Central Europe. Prussia, although hesitant, maintained neutrality, waiting to see which side would prevail. Napoleon watched events closely. He knew that if he delayed, France would find itself surrounded. The army, previously assembled on the Channel coast for the invasion of England, was encamped at Boulogne. But when it became clear that a land war was inevitable, he abandoned his ambitions for a seaborne invasion and focused all his attention on Germany. The speed with which he restructured his strategy amazed even his most experienced generals. Within weeks, he organized the army's crossing of the Rhine. Over 200,000 men, united in the Grande Army, moved along a meticulously calculated route, avoiding engagement until a decisive advantage was achieved. The main task was to defeat the Austrian army before the Russian troops could arrive. The Austrian commander, General Karl Mack, concentrated his main forces near the city of Ulm, hoping the French would not arrive quickly enough. He planned to hold his positions and await his allies. But Napoleon undertook a completely different operation. Instead of a frontal assault, he executed a series of maneuvers, outflanked the Austrians from the north, crossed the Danube, and closed the encirclement. Ulm was trapped. Austrian units tried to break out but were intercepted. On October 20, 1805, after several days of unsuccessful breakout attempts, General Mack capitulated. Over 25,000 soldiers surrendered. The victory was achieved without a general engagement, through speed, precision of calculation, and coordination of columns. After Ulm, the road to Vienna lay open. Napoleon entered the Austrian capital in November. But the war was not over. The main allied forces, the Russian army under Kutuzov and Alexander I himself, as well as the remnants of the Austrians retreated into Moravia. Napoleon understood. His army was exhausted, supply lines stretched, and the longer the war dragged on, the greater the risk of Prussian intervention or a new uprising in his rear. He had to deliver one decisive blow, choosing the plateau near the town of Austerlitz as the battlefield. He provoked the Allies into a fight. To achieve the desired scenario, Napoleon engaged in a subtle military game. He demonstratively weakened his right flank, withdrew some troops, and created the impression that the French were unable to hold their position. It was a trap. On the morning of December 2, 1805, exactly on the anniversary of his coronation, the battle began. The morning mist concealed troop movements. The Russo-Austrian army began an offensive against the French right flank exactly where Napoleon wanted them. When their main forces became bogged down in the attack, he suddenly struck in the center. French corps stormed the Pratzen Heights, splitting the Allied army in two. From that moment, the battle took on a swift and inexorable course. The Allied center forces were surrounded and scattered, and the flanks were demoralized. Artillery fired upon the retreating troops. At the ponds near the village of Sokolness, Allied troops tried to cross on thin ice, which began to crack under the roar of cannon fire. Hundreds of soldiers went under the water. Equipment sank, order disintegrated. By evening, it was all over. The Allies lost over 30,000 men killed, wounded, and captured. French losses were 3 times fewer. Alexander I hastily retreated, shocked and disappointed. Francis I, left alone, sued for peace. The Treaty of Pressburg, signed in December, cemented the political consequences of the victory. Austria left the coalition, renounced its claims to Italy, and Germany paid an indemnity and ceded significant territories. France was finally established as the dominant power in Europe, but Napoleon did not stop at peace. He decided to redraw the map of Germany. The following year, under French protectorate, the Confederation of the Rhine was created, an association of 16 German principalities that seceded from the Holy Roman Empire. This marked the effective end of an empire that had existed for nearly 1,000 years. Francis I renounced the title of Emperor of the Germans. The old order, based on vassal loyalty, was destroyed. From this moment on, the map of Europe no longer obeyed old borders. It was now drawn in the headquarters of the French army, approved by decrees from the Tuileries, and sealed on treaties dictated to the defeated. The Battle of Austerlitz was not just a military victory. It established Napoleon's image as a man capable of reshaping the world not only with a sword, but also with political calculation. His empire no longer seemed a temporary anomaly. It had become the new norm. For some, an object of admiration. For others, an object of fear. After the defeat of the Third Coalition, after Austerlitz and the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine, France entered a new phase of its existence, a phase of strengthening and institutionalizing power. Victory in war gave the empire political supremacy, but it was important to Napoleon that his power felt solid not only on the battlefield, but also in the daily lives of millions. At this time, the empire reached its highest point of internal stability. All key mechanisms of the state were in operation. The army remained combat-ready, finances stable, the people generally loyal. But behind this external calm was painstaking work to transform revolutionary chaos into a centralized hierarchy subordinate to one will. The main instrument of this transformation was the administrative reforms begun during the consulate, but finalized under the empire. France was divided into departments, each headed by a prefect appointed from Paris. Prefects were not elected, did not answer to local elites, but directly carried out the will of the central government. They controlled tax collection, oversight of schools, police, construction, public order. Below them sub-prefects, mayors, councillors also not elected, but appointed. The democratic elements that the revolution had still tried to preserve were finally abolished. Power no longer came from below. It descended from above clearly, consistently, without right of discussion. This new structure required a unified legal foundation. And here the Napoleonic Code comes to the fore. One of the most significant projects in the history of Western jurisprudence. Work on it began during the Consulate, but it was published in 1804, and in subsequent years received dozens of additions and clarifications. It was not just a collection of laws, it was a political statement. The Code enshrined the principles of equality before the law, inviolability of property, freedom of contract, secular marriage, and civil responsibility. It eliminated class distinctions, abolished privileges by birth, and systematized judicial practice. Men were given primacy in the family, and the state gained control over civil affairs. Women, according to the Code, were subordinate to their husbands. Divorces were restricted. Paternal authority became absolute. From a legal standpoint, this was a giant step forward. From a political standpoint, it was an instrument of legitimation. For now the empire had an official legal basis, clear, rational, and uniform from Lille to Marseille. The Code was also exported to dependent states, to Italy, to Belgium, to the Confederation of the Rhine. It became a symbol of the French model of civilization, secular, centralized, legally formalized. But Napoleon understood that stability was impossible without symbols. He needed to create a new elite that would replace the burned and exiled aristocracy of the old regime. And so, in 1808, he established the imperial nobility. This was not a return to nobles by blood. It was the creation of a nobility based on merit. The new counts, barons, viscounts, and dukes were generals, judges, administrators, scientists, and officials who had served the state faithfully. They were awarded lands, titles, sometimes pensions. But most importantly, they gained a place in the new vertical hierarchy, where everyone knew their position and their duties. Symbols of this new aristocracy were established: coats of arms, seals, robes, official receptions. The imperial court became a full-fledged copy of the royal court, but without dynastic clans, without hereditary exclusivity. The legend that every soldier carried a marshal's baton in his knapsack now continued in the form of titles and awards. Alongside this, state propaganda flourished. Artists painted Napoleon not as a politician, but as an ancient hero. Writers compared him to Caesar and Alexander. School textbooks told of him as the savior of the nation. Coins were minted with his profile. Portraits of the emperor were hung in town halls and courts. All this shaped an image. Power in the country was not only efficient, but also infallible. By 1807, the empire represented a single, well-oiled mechanism. Its economy was growing, trade developing, the financial system under control. Provinces governed quickly and strictly. The army had a clear conscription system, regular drills, and a heroic aura. At its head stood a man addressed not as your majesty, but as sire. And yet, behind this visible order, there was an internal, tense rhythm. The entire system rested on the personal energy and control of one man. He did not delegate. He signed hundreds of decrees a day. He intervened in judicial matters, architectural projects, school textbooks, and complaints about bread. Everything went through him, and this gave a feeling of power, but also made the system vulnerable. A new looming coalition, the economic struggle with England, growing ambitions beyond Europe, all this was approaching. But for now, the empire was at its zenith, and it seemed it could last forever. During this period, schools and lycées were built in France, subordinate to the state and its ideology. Education became an instrument for raising citizens of the empire. The teaching of history, literature, law, everything was oriented towards developing loyalty to the system, discipline, and respect for order. Universities came under the control of ministries. Engineering schools appeared, training administrators, military men, technocrats. More and more young people began their careers not through the church or family connections, but through service. Thus, by 1807, the empire represented a single, well-oiled mechanism. Its economy was growing, trade developing, the financial system under control. Provinces governed quickly and strictly. The army had a clear conscription system, regular drills, and a heroic aura. At its head stood a man addressed not as your majesty, but as sire. And yet, behind this visible order, there was an internal, tense rhythm. The entire system rested on the personal energy and control of one man. He did not delegate. He signed hundreds of decrees a day. He intervened in judicial matters, architectural projects, school textbooks, and complaints about bread. Everything went through him, and this gave a feeling of power, but also made the system vulnerable. A new looming coalition, the economic struggle with England, growing ambitions beyond Europe, all this was approaching. But for now, the empire was at its zenith, and it seemed it could last forever. By 1806, Napoleon's empire had reached the peak of its power. The military machine was perfected, laws functioned. France controlled not only its historic borders, but also a significant part of Central Europe. The Netherlands, northern Italy, Switzerland, the Confederation of the Rhine, in the eyes of Europe. This was no longer just a victorious state, but a new imperial reality with which one must either come to terms or engage in a final struggle. But not everyone decided to come to terms. Against the backdrop of Paris's peaceful brilliance and the orderly life of the French prefectures, tension was again brewing in Berlin, Vienna, and St. Petersburg. The situation was particularly alarming in Prussia's state that had so far remained neutral. But Prussia watched with great irritation as French influence spread along the Rhine, approaching its own borders. King Frederick William III, indecisive and slow by nature, hesitated for a long time. But his entourage, especially the military and court nationalists, increasingly pushed him to action. Prussia had not participated in the Third Coalition and now, in the opinion of its politicians, had the moral right to restore balance. Particularly painful was Napoleon's entry into Berlin's sphere of influence. The Confederation of the Rhine included principalities that Prussia considered its clients. The decisive push was a personal insult. In August 1806, Napoleon, without consulting Berlin, annexed the Duchy of Cleves-Burg and offered it to his brother-in-law Joachim Murat. This was perceived as a slap in the face. In October, Prussia declared war. Its army, which had not yet participated in modern campaigns, marched forth, confident in its glorious traditions from the time of Frederick the Great. However, this confidence was based more on memory than on reality. Napoleon, without waiting for the enemy's initiative, led the Grande Army north. His strategy was the same: rapid march, sudden concentration, attack on the flank and rear. By mid-October, French corps began closing in on the main Prussian forces concentrated near the towns of Jena and Arstedt. On October 14, 1806, two battles took place simultaneously near these two towns. History often refers to them by one name, Jena-Arstedt. In reality, they were two different battles, unfolding concurrently. Napoleon personally commanded the army at Jena. His opponent was the Duke of Brunswick, an elderly and indecisive man whose actions were characterized by slowness and uncertainty. The French attacked at dawn, and throughout the day the battle was fought with varying success. But by noon, the emperor committed his reserves, and the Prussian line was broken. A retreat began that turned into a rout. At the same time, near Arstedt, Marshal de Vaux, with only 26,000 men at his disposal, encountered the Prussian army. Numbering over 60,000, it seemed he had no chance, but discipline, artillery fire, and the tenacity of the French infantry ensured an incredible victory. The Prussian army wavered and retreated, leaving the battlefield to de Vaux, to whom Napoleon later rightly granted the title Duke of Arstedt. By evening, it was clear Prussia had been defeated in a single day. Napoleon advanced further. He soon entered Berlin, where he spent several weeks establishing a new order. Arsenals were confiscated, bridges and roads brought under control, French soldiers occupied barracks, museums, and palaces. The city, once the center of Prussian spirit, was now a staging post for new campaigns. But Napoleon did not limit himself to military measures. It was in Berlin that he issued one of his most important political economic acts, the Berlin Decree, signed in late October 1806. The essence of the decree was as follows. France declared Great Britain to be in a state of complete economic blockade, all ports controlled by the Empire, and its allies were closed to British ships. Trade with England was outlawed. Control over correspondence, goods, and ships was introduced. English goods were subject to confiscation, and ships subject to seizure. Even neutral countries were ordered to choose. Either they trade with France or with London. This was the beginning of the so-called Continental System, a grandiose economic campaign aimed at strangling Great Britain. Napoleon could not defeat her at sea, but he hoped to destroy her trading empire by cutting off access to European markets. On paper, the system looked powerful and merciless. In practice, it required colossal efforts, the creation of a customs service, surveillance of the coast, monitoring of merchants and diplomats, sanctions, confiscations, repression against violators. Some countries resisted. Some, like Russia, formally agreed but violated the ban through neutral intermediaries. Smuggling flourished, but the gesture itself had immense symbolic weight. Napoleon had challenged not an army, but a trading network, not a state, but a global economy. As the blockade began to take effect, the emperor continued his advance. The remnants of the Prussian army retreated eastward towards the borders of Poland. Russian troops were already approaching there. The war with Prussia was imperceptibly turning into a war with Russia. A new phase of the struggle was beginning, even more difficult and bloody. But for now, France stood in Berlin. The empire was at its zenith. Behind Napoleon were Austerlitz, Jena, Berlin. Ahead lay snow, mud, and the first hints that the geography of Europe resisted as stubbornly as its armies. By the winter of 1806, France found itself in the heart of northern Europe. Prussia lay defeated, its capital occupied, its army shattered, its king in flight. But Napoleon's triumph was incomplete. The main rival, for whom the Fourth Coalition had been assembled, had not yet entered the fray. Russia, driven by Alexander I's desire to halt the spread of the Napoleonic system, continued to concentrate troops in the east, in territories formerly belonging to Poland. The winter campaign promised to be harsh. Napoleon's army, exhausted after Jena and the forced marches through Saxony, entered a region where climate and logistics dictated unfamiliar conditions for the French. Nevertheless, the emperor did not intend to wait for spring. He sought to strike before the Russians could fully consolidate. By early 1807, the French had advanced northeast. In January, the first major clash occurred, the Battle of Jankowo, where Marshal Bennigsen, commanding the Russian troops, managed to retreat with his forces organized. Napoleon tried to intercept him and force a decisive battle, but the Russian army slipped away. In February, it took up positions near Eylau, a small town in East Prussia, surrounded by snow and ice-covered fields. The Battle of Eylau, fought from February 7th to 8th, 1807, became one of the most terrible in Napoleon's career. It began in conditions where snow and blizzards concealed troop movements. Artillery bogged down in snowdrifts, and men had difficulty orienting themselves on the terrain. Over 100,000 soldiers were engaged on both sides. The French faced not only Russian corps but also the fierce weather. The first day of the battle was chaotic. The French tried to break through the center of the Russian position, but encountered stubborn resistance. Artillery fire was an effective cannonballs stuck in the snow. Cavalry charges yielded no results. Fighting raged for every village, every farmstead. By evening, Napoleon realized he could not achieve a breakthrough. The temperature dropped further during the night. Soldiers slept on the ground, huddled together. Some froze to death. By morning, the French army was exhausted, but unexpectedly, Marshal Davout's corps arrived on the field, approaching from the south. His appearance allowed for a second wave of attack. Nevertheless, despite enormous efforts, the Russian army was not defeated. It retreated in good order, leaving the field but retaining its fighting capacity. Losses were horrific, over 20,000 killed, wounded, and missing on each side. The snow was stained black and crimson. Even Napoleon, always eager to emphasize the magnitude of his victories, avoided triumphant statements this time. This was the first battle he did not win decisively, and perhaps the first where he truly understood that the war in the East would be different. In the spring of 1807, hostilities resumed. The Russian army again took up. The meeting place was unusual, the town of Tilsit on the border between Russia and Prussia, through which flowed the Niemen River. A raft platform was constructed in the middle of the river, upon which a pavilion was erected, designed as a neutral zone. Napoleon and Alexander met in person. Little is known about their conversation, but eyewitnesses said that mutual respect, and perhaps sympathy, quickly developed between them. Alexander, charming, young, speaking French, made an impression. Napoleon, confident, calculating, having achieved everything himself, inspired admiration. The result of the meeting was the Treaties of Tilsit, signed in July 1807. Russia withdrew from the war, effectively becoming an ally of France. Alexander agreed to join the continental system, ceasing trade with Great Britain. In return, France promised not to interfere in Russia's internal affairs and to recognize its interests in the East. For Prussia, the treaty was devastating. It lost nearly half its territory, including the Polish lands on which Napoleon created the Duchy of Warsaw buffer state. Formerly independent, but completely controlled by Paris, Prussia was reduced to a vassal state. King Frederick William was forced to humiliatingly await his turn for a meeting with the Emperor of France. After Tilsit, Napoleon controlled almost all of continental Europe, from the Atlantic to the Vistula. From Hamburg to Naples, French was spoken. The code was in effect. Convoys with French weapons and officials traveled. He had achieved the impossible. He had divided Europe with Russia, pushing aside all old borders and imposing a new geopolitics on the world. But behind all this grandeur, troubling shadows were already lurking. The blockade of England was not working perfectly. Smuggling was growing. In Spain, popular discontent was brewing, and Alexander, although he had signed the alliance, did not intend to obey Paris forever. But for now, the empire triumphed. Soldiers marched to trumpet calls. Convoys headed west, carrying gold and grain. Europe paused for a moment, with the feeling that everything was already decided, that history had ended. But it was only beginning. After the triumph at Tilsit, Napoleon's empire seemed unshakable. To the east, peace with Russia. To the north, subjugated Prussia. To the south, allied Italy. Only one adversary continued to elude him: Great Britain, the island power that could not be broken by blockade, fleet, or diplomacy. It was precisely to economically strangle England that Napoleon continued to enforce the continental system. He demanded that all countries of Europe, even neutral and allied ones, cease all trade relations with London. But there was one country that formally followed the rules, but in reality turned a blind eye to smuggling: Portugal. The Portuguese royal family, closely tied to the British, did not want to break off trade with them, and Napoleon decided to force it into submission. To do this, he needed to go through Spain, a formerly allied country, but ruled by the aging King Charles IV and his unpopular favorite, Godoy. Initially, French troops entered Spanish territory under the pretext of a joint expedition against Portugal. But very quickly, the situation changed. Instead of a limited invasion, Napoleon began systematically occupying key Spanish cities. He acted with growing confidence, as if Spain was not an ally but a future vassal. In France and Paris, these steps were seen as another step towards creating a pan-continental empire. But in Spain itself, everything looked different. The people felt humiliated, the aristocracy anxious, the military bewildered. Matters were complicated by a conflict erupting within the Spanish dynasty between Charles IV and his son, Prince Ferdinand. Napoleon, seeking to exploit the situation, summoned both to Bayonne, a French town near the border. There, in an atmosphere of pressure and threats, he forced Charles IV to abdicate. His son, who had already proclaimed himself king, was also deprived of power. The Spanish throne was vacant. Napoleon offered it to his brother Joseph Bonaparte, who had previously ruled Naples. Thus, France theoretically gained another allied monarchy, but in practice opened the door to the most destructive war of the entire empire. Joseph's appointment did not inspire enthusiasm in Madrid. On the contrary, it was a spark. On May 2, 1808, an uprising broke out in the capital. Crowds of citizens attacked French garrisons, killed officers, and set fire to barracks. In response, Marshal Murat, commanding the army in Spain, ordered a merciless suppression. The streets of Madrid ran with blood, executions were carried out publicly, prisoners were shot. Perhaps never before had the French army acted with such brutality against a civilian population. But Madrid was only the beginning. News of the uprising spread throughout the country. In Zaragoza, Valencia, Seville, uprisings began. Everywhere, centers of resistance sprang up. The peculiarity of the situation was that it was not the army, but the people who rose to defend their land. Spanish peasants, artisans, monks, former soldiers all took up arms. The French were confronted not with a regular war, but with a new type of guerrilla movement. Unexpected, chaotic, but extremely effective. Napoleon's soldiers were used to fighting armies. They knew how to win battles, but now they found themselves in an unfamiliar country where the enemy could be anyone. A beggar on the road, a trader in a village, a boy with a gun in the forest. Columns were ambushed, bridges blown up, convoys looted. Any advance required protection and reconnaissance. The army became bogged down in provinces where every day could be the last. Joseph Bonaparte entered Madrid, but sat there as if in a besieged fortress. Outside the capital, he controlled almost nothing. French generals, despite their skill, were powerless against a people's war. Even where they won, as at Okaka or Medellin, victory did not bring stability. When they left a void immediately filled by insurgents. All this happened against a backdrop of brutal reprisals, which only intensified hatred for the occupiers. City after city, village after village, the situation repeated itself. French units fought not so much against an army as against the land itself. In the mountains of Cantabria, the forests of Asturias, the plains of Extremadura, the enemy was everywhere and nowhere at once. Gradually, the situation became even more acute. British troops under General Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, landed to aid the Spanish insurgents. His army was small but disciplined. It landed at various ports, coordinated with the insurgents, and organized logistics. With each passing month, it became increasingly difficult for the French. Spain had become a black hole for the empire. Napoleon was forced to transfer corps there that were needed elsewhere. He even came to Spain himself at the end of 1808 to personally lead the campaign. He won several battles, defeated enemy forces at Espinosa and Somosierra, and brought Madrid back under full control. But this did not change the essence of what was happening. Each victory cost more, and the result remained temporary. Meanwhile, internal resistance in France was growing. Coffins with soldiers were returning. Spain was becoming a symbol of senseless and endless war. For the first time in his years of rule, the emperor had to explain to society why this war was being fought, why his brother sat on the throne of a country that hated France, and what, exactly, came next. The heroes of this war were not only on the side of the empire. The names of Spanish leaders, such as General Costacos, Father Mendizabal, the guerrilla Juan Martin, became national symbols. Artists, writers, folk songs all turned to the theme of liberation, not capitulation. By 1810, the war continued, and its end was nowhere in sight. Spain did not fall, but it did not win. France did not lose, but it did not control. This was the first crack in the edifice of the empire, invisible but deeply threatening. Spain showed even the most powerful army in Europe could find itself helpless if an entire country rose up against it. By the beginning of 1812, France outwardly remained the center of the most powerful empire Europe had known since the time of Charlemagne. The territories controlled directly by Napoleon or through vassal states stretched from the Atlantic to the Vistula, from the Baltic Sea to Naples. The French code was in effect in Warsaw and Vienna. French viceroys governed Holland and northern Italy, and in the palaces of Europe sat his brothers, marshals, and trusted officials. In Paris, there was splendor, parades, balls, architecture, newspapers, military marches. At first glance, the empire was invulnerable, but internally tension was seething. The economy was creaking under the strain of the continental system, the very one Napoleon had imposed on the entire continent to strangle British trade. Smuggling grew, prices fluctuated, provinces grumbled. The army was increasingly filled with recruits who had to be forced into service. In Spain, an endless, bloody, and feudal war raged. In the north, discontent in Holland. In Germany, weariness from taxes and humiliation. Napoleon himself, despite his seeming unshakability, also felt that the system needed strengthening. By 1810, he had long ceased to be a revolutionary. He had become an emperor in the classical sense, a man preoccupied with legacy, dynasty, legitimacy. And it was from this calculation that he made one of the most dramatic decisions of his life: to divorce Josephine. Josephine de Beauharnais, his first wife, was a woman he loved passionately, but she could not bear him an heir. Napoleon long postponed the decision, hoping the doctors were mistaken. But by 1809, it became clear, if he wanted his empire to outlive him, he must have a son. In December 1809, at court, he announced the divorce. It was not a tragedy of passion. It was an act of political will. He did not leave Josephine in poverty, but he completely dissolved their union, and soon he entered into a new marriage with Marie-Louise, daughter of the Emperor of Austria. This union was a step towards recognition. Through it, Napoleon became not just a ruler from the lower classes, but an equal to the old dynasties of Europe. In 1811, an heir was born, Napoleon II, in Napoleon's eyes. This was the establishment of a new dynasty, a new world in which he was not a usurper, but a legitimate emperor. But it was precisely at this moment, at the peak of power, that alliances began to crumble. Austria, an ally by marriage, remained cold. Prussia had paid its indemnities but awaited a chance to free itself. The British fleet controlled the seas. Trade was collapsing. Protests flared up in Italy. And most importantly, Russia began slowly but decisively to distance itself from France. Alexander I was an ally only on paper. He felt humiliated. The continental system harmed Russian interests. Trade with England remained vital, especially for northern merchants. Furthermore, Russia watched with alarm the strengthening of the Duchy of Warsaw, created by Napoleon on the lands of former Poland, for St. Petersburg. This was a direct threat. All this led to diplomatic relations becoming strained by 1811, and by the spring of 1812. Tense to the limit, Napoleon decided to act first. He began assembling the Grande Army, the largest the continent had ever known. Over 600,000 men from all corners of Europe, French, Poles, Italians, Germans, Dutch, Austrians. This was not just a campaign. It was an act of imperial will. He hoped that one swift campaign, as in Austria or Prussia, would force Alexander to the negotiating table. On June 22, 1812, the army crossed the Niemen River and entered Russian territory. But the campaign did not follow the usual script. The Russian army, divided into two parts under the command of Barclay de Tolly and Bagration, avoided battles and retreated deeper into the country. Villages were burned, depots destroyed, inhabitants fled into the forests. This was the scorched earth strategy. Napoleon hoped for a battle, but it was not offered. The French marched through a depopulated country, exhausting their strength, losing thousands without firing a shot. With each passing day, supply wagons fell behind, problems with food multiplied. Equipment had to be abandoned. Heat gave way to cold nights, and words like dysentery, hunger, mutiny increasingly appeared in army reports. Within the Russian command, debates also raged. Barclay insisted on continuing the retreat. He believed time was on Russia's side. Bagration and other generals demanded battle, and undergrowing public and military pressure. Alexander appointed Mikhail Illarionovich Kutuzov as commander-in-chief. Kutuzov was not a proponent of battle at any cost, but he knew if he retreated from Moscow, he could not hold the army, and he chose a place where he could meet the enemy near the village of Borodino. This point on the map, with rivers, hills, open spaces, allowed for the construction of a defensive line. There were redoubts, forest edges, plains for artillery, and most importantly, it lay on the direct road to Moscow. It was the last natural barrier. Kutuzov began hurried preparations. Guns were emplaced, fortifications built, trenches dug. The center of the defense was the Raevsky Redoubt. The flanks were covered by the Bagration fletches and the Semyonovskoye positions. On September 7, 1812, the Battle of Borodino took place. The French began the battle with a powerful artillery bombardment. Within hours, the field was covered in smoke and dust. Attacks were launched against the Russian right flank, then the center. The French lost thousands. Bagration was mortally wounded. Cavalry galloped across the field. Napoleon did not commit the guard. By the end of the battle, Kutuzov had preserved the core of his army. Losses were terrible, 30 to 40,000 on each side. But Kutuzov's army was not destroyed. It withdrew, preserving its nucleus. Napoleon had gained the road to Moscow, but ahead of him lay a city he did not expect. Moscow was empty. The inhabitants had left. There were almost no supplies left in the city, and soon fires broke out. First in a few quarters, then in dozens. Fire consumed the city in a matter of days. Of the wooden Moscow, only ruins remained. It is believed the fires were not accidental. Many buildings were deliberately set on fire. Governor Rostopchin had sent away the fire brigades and left the city himself. The troops had no food. Horses fell from hunger. The catastrophe in Russia not only claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, it opened before Europe a window of opportunity that all of Napoleon's opponents had long awaited. Until 1812, France seemed invincible. None of the previous coalitions had been able to withstand the empire's onslaught. But with the destruction of the Grande Army, the very army that Napoleon had led across Europe to the gates of Moscow, the myth of his invincibility vanished. In its place arose a feeling, now he could be crushed. When in December Napoleon, secretly abandoning the army, returned to Paris, he acted with his former determination. He convened the Council of State, assured everyone the situation was under control, and began a new mobilization. France, exhausted, orphaned, in mourning, received a new call-up. Young boys, inexperienced, often poorly trained, were called up to replace the veterans. The mobilization was ironically nicknamed the Army of Beardless Youths. But for Napoleon, there was no other choice. He knew the coalition was preparing for a new war, and he sought to strike first. In the spring of 1813, the French army again crossed the Rhine. But this time, everything was different. For liberation from the French yoke, unrest flared up in the cities. French garrisons increasingly felt like occupiers. By autumn, it was clear that a decisive clash was inevitable. It occurred in October near Leipzig, a city located at the intersection of key roads and rivers. On one side, Napoleon's army, about 200,000 men, tired but still formidable. On the other, the forces of the Sixth Coalition, nearly 350,000 soldiers, Russians, Austrians, Swedes, reserve corps from Saxony and Bavaria. The Battle of Leipzig lasted for days. The first day was limited. The French held their positions, but with each passing day, the Allies intensified pressure, bringing up reserves. On the third day, a full-scale offensive began. Napoleon, lacking sufficient forces to hold the front, ordered a retreat. On the night of October 19th, the crossing of the Elster River began. But by a tragic accident, the bridge over the river was blown up too early. Thousands of soldiers were cut off from the main forces. They perished, were captured, or drowned. Among the dead was Marshal Poniatowski, the only Pole among the marshals of the empire. He fought to the end and drowned trying to swim to safety. The Battle of Leipzig, named the Battle of the Nations, became the largest battle of that era. Losses on both sides exceeded 100,000 men. But most importantly, it was a turning point. After it, the French army retreated not just from the battlefield. It retreated from Central Europe. During the winter, Napoleon lost control of Germany, Bavaria, Saxony, the Westphalian lands. The Confederation of the Rhine, former allies, now went over to the coalition side. Uprisings began in Holland. Anti-French detachments formed in Switzerland. Prussia liberated Berlin. Austria took Tyrol, even in Italy. The French administration began to crack at the seams. Napoleon retreated to the Rhine. He was no longer the master of Europe. His world was shrinking to the borders of France itself. But even here, he did not give up. In January 1814, coalition armies crossed the French border. Alexander I. Blucher, Schwarzenberg all advanced on Paris from different directions. And at this seemingly deathly moment for the empire, Napoleon displayed miracles of military skill. He conducted the campaign of the Sixth Coalition in France with rare flexibility. Maneuvering between enemy columns, he defeated Allied forces piecemeal. Victories at Champaubert, Montmirail, Château-Thierry, these were his last military triumphs. Small detachments struck with surgical precision. Officers and the guard followed him as in former times. He believed he could repeat the miracle, but the miracle no longer worked. The Allies were approaching Paris. Napoleon's armies were exhausted. Mobilizations no longer helped. The people were worn out. The economy was destroyed. Parliament began openly discussing the possibility of deposing the emperor. The Bourbons, the former dynasty, were again being mentioned in political circles. On March 31, 1814, the Allies entered Paris. It was a shock for all of France. The city, accustomed to victory parades, now received a foreign army. Alexander I entered sullenly, but without mockery. He declared that he did not seek revenge. He sought peace. At Fontainebleau, where Napoleon was staying, there was a depressing silence. Generals came one after another, urging him to abdicate. The Senate had already formed a provisional government. The people did not rise to defend him. And finally, after 2 weeks of struggle, on April 6, 1814, Napoleon abdicated, first in favor of his son. But the Allies did not recognize such a succession. Then he signed an unconditional abdication. He was allowed to retain the title of emperor, but not over France, but over an island. He was granted personal sovereignty over the island of Elba, a tiny speck of land off the coast of Tuscany. He was given a guard, a small retinue, and even allowed to have a personal guard. On April 11th, Napoleon bid farewell to the guard on the stone staircase at Fontainebleau. He embraced the old soldiers, looked long into their eyes, and said, "I thank you, soldiers. I have walked with you along the path of glory. Now I go into exile, but your name will live through the ages." Thus ended the First Empire, but not the story of Bonaparte himself, because he was not a man capable of accepting an ending if he felt even one step was still possible. In the spring of 1814, when Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba, a period of peace settled over Europe. Napoleon watched this closely. He read reports, caught rumors, sensed the Allied powers again united. In the northeast, the forces of the German states and Austria gathered. In the south, the British offensive in Spain continued. In Belgium, a British corps under the Duke of Wellington was stationed. Nearby, in the area of Namur and Waver, troops of the Kingdom of Prussia under Field Marshal Blücher concentrated. Napoleon decided not to wait for the blow. He moved north to preempt the junction of the enemy armies and defeat them separately. His plan repeated the strategy of former years: swift advance, isolating fronts, quick victory. On June 16th, at Ligny, he attacked and defeated Blücher's army. However, the victory was incomplete. The troops were not destroyed, but retreated in good order, retaining their fighting capacity. On June 18th, he met Wellington near the village of Waterloo. The terrain was unfavorable after rains. The ground was waterlogged. Cavalry lost momentum. British troops occupied hills and farms, fortified them, forming a dense defense. Napoleon planned to crush the British before fresh forces arrived from the east. He knew Blücher's army was still somewhere nearby. The battle lasted all day. The French cavalry attacked with fury. The Guard held firm. Flanks changed hands repeatedly, but the British lines did not break, and when fresh Prussian units began to appear on the field, the very ones that had retreated from Ligny, the situation changed decisively. The army he had failed to finish off was now striking his flank. Napoleon committed the Old Guard. These were his best troops, experienced, disciplined, loyal to the end, but even they could not turn the tide of the battle. When they began to fall back, a murmur spread across the field. The Guard is retreating. It was the signal. All was lost. The army disintegrated. The retreat turned into a rout. France was again left defenseless. The emperor returned to Paris, but Paris was different. Here, they no longer awaited victory. They awaited the end. For days after Waterloo, on June 22, 1815, Napoleon abdicated for the second time. He no longer asked to retain the throne for his son. He only hoped to be left in peace. He wanted to flee to America, anywhere, but the British fleet blockaded the ports. He surrendered to an English captain, hoping for honor and magnanimity. But the English decided otherwise. He was not brought to London. He was not handed over to France. He was sent to a place from which he would not return, the island of St. Helena, in the middle of the Atlantic, 1,000 miles from the nearest shore. A tiny patch of land, devoid of trees, with a harsh climate and a British garrison. There, he was to die not as a hero on the battlefield, but as an exile in silence, where the only weapons left were paper and memory. When the English ship Northumberland put to sea and set course south, everything was already decided. Napoleon no longer belonged to France, Europe, the army, or even the history of the current moment. He was leaving the world in which he had acted and entering a world of memories, reflections, regrets, and slow decline. The journey took 2 months. He spent the summer of 1815 in his cabin, gazing at the endless horizon. When the ship crossed the equator, the soldiers held traditional nautical ceremonies. He did not participate. He knew this was not just a voyage. It was a funeral procession, taking place while he was still alive. The island of St. Helena, where he was to spend the rest of his days, proved to be exactly as the British had intended: bleak, isolated, cold, rocks, wind, boundless ocean, garrison, silence. He arrived there in October 1815 and soon settled at Longwood House, a gloomy, windswept house standing on high ground, from which no ship was visible on the horizon. It was like a prison without bars, escape from which was impossible due to geography. Only a few remained with him: loyal officers, servants, doctors. Among them were General Bertrand, Marshal Gourgaud, Count Las Cases. It was Las Cases who would become his first interlocutor and the first chronicler of these years. Napoleon dictated his memoirs to him. During long evenings, with the wind howling outside, he spoke of Egypt, of Toulon, of Marengo, of Austerlitz. He returned to his past campaigns, analyzed the feats, justified himself, explained, argued. no longer with opponents, but with history. These accounts became the basis of the famous Memorial de Saint-Éloi. Napoleon was recreating himself anew, not just as a military leader, but as a figure of destiny. He spoke not as an exile, but as a prophet. For him, this was the final battle, the battle for how he would be remembered. And he did not intend to lose it. But the years took their toll. The damp climate, nerves, poor food, conflicts with the new British governor, Hudson Lowe, who strictly controlled his every move. All this destroyed his health. Pains appeared, insomnia, bouts of fatigue, irritability. In letters, he complained increasingly of loneliness, of Europe's betrayal, of the injustice of his fate. He read a lot, Cicero, Livy, Plutarch, spent hours in the garden, slowly pacing among the bushes. Sometimes, when it rained, he simply sat by the window and gazed into the gray mist. He continued to follow politics, received old newspapers, discussed the situation in France, predicted revolutions. He lived in the past, but thought of the future. In the spring of 1821, his condition deteriorated sharply. Doctors suspected stomach cancer, the disease from which his father had died. The symptoms were agonizing. He lost weight, suffered from fevers, could not eat. His last weeks he spent in bed, barely rising. He had no strength left for dictation or walks. On May 5, 1821, in the afternoon, he asked for his will to be read to him. In it, he requested to be buried on the banks of the Seine, among the French people he said he had always loved. Towards evening, he lost consciousness. His last words, according to eyewitnesses, were, "France, army, head of the army, Josephine." He died far from his homeland, without glory, without crowds, without flags. His body was placed in a simple sarcophagus and buried under a willow tree in a shady spot, where there were no monuments or epitaphs. No name was inscribed on the grave, only "Here lies." But the peace was short-lived. 20 years later, in 1840, France obtained from England the right to return Napoleon's remains to his homeland. Millions greeted him in Paris. A funeral barge floated along. Streets were strewn with flags. People wept. Boys dressed in uniforms. Old men recalled the campaigns. He was buried at Les Invalides in a huge crypt under the dome, where even architecture bows before his name. Thus ended the journey of a man who began as an unknown artillery officer from the island of Corsica and became a symbol of the most turbulent era in European history. He was loved, feared, cursed, but no one could forget him because, as someone would later say of him, he was not just a man. He was an age doing battle with eternity. He lived only 51 years less than many rulers, less than many generals. But within his life was contained what would have taken others centuries. He rose swiftly and fell with resounding force. He was an artillery student and the master of Europe, an outcast and a lawgiver, a dictator and a reformer. Within him coexisted cruelty and genius, cold calculation and a burning faith in destiny. He left behind no dynasty, no stable system, no peaceful legacy. But he left an era. After him, nothing was the same. War became different, politics different, Europe different. He destroyed the old order. But in its ruins he sowed new ideas, equality before the law, civil liberties, the right to talent. Centuries have passed, but the debate about him has not ended. For some, he is a despot and usurper. For others, a genius and hero. For all, he is an enigma to which one wishes to return again and again. Empires disappear, monuments crumble, but a story told in the first person, the story of a man who challenged the entire world, remains.